Prologue. The day everything changed. Let me tell you something about humans. We're not just another species in the vast galactic catalog of sentient beings. We're the cosmic equivalent of a Swiss Army knife mixed with a dumpster fire, unpredictable, slightly terrifying, and inexplicably effective. The Galactic Historical Archives will tell you that first contact happened on a crisp Tuesday in 2184. But what those sanitized records won't mention is how spectacularly bizarre that encounter actually was. Most first contact scenarios involve careful diplomatic protocols, delicate communication attempts, and measured scientific observation. Ours? Not so much. When the Krellanax Confederation's deep space exploration vessel first encountered human technology, they expected a calm, methodical introduction. What they got was a transmission that began with heavy metal music, contained 3 separate jokes about the captain's mother, and ended with a mathematical proof explaining exactly why the Krellanax navigation systems were fundamentally flawed. The transmission was sent by a junior communications officer, who was, according to later reports, slightly tipsy and completely done with bureaucratic nonsense. The Krellanax were simultaneously offended, impressed, and utterly confused. This, as it would turn out, would become the standard reaction to humans throughout the galaxy. What made humans unique wasn't our technology, though it was impressive. It wasn't our physical capabilities, which were middling at best compared to most spacefaring species. What set us apart was our absolute refusal to follow any predetermined script. We didn't just think outside the box. We looked at the box, laughed, repurposed it into a makeshift rocket, and then used it to solve problems nobody knew existed. Take the Great Proxima Negotiation of 2192, for example. A conflict that had stymied 5 different alien diplomatic corps for decades was resolved by a human ambassador who arrived wearing mismatched socks, brought an inexplicable collection of vintage Earth board games, and solved the entire geopolitical crisis through an elaborate metaphor involving monopoly and international trade regulations. The other species started to realize something fundamental about humans. We were wildly unpredictable problem solvers, who viewed impossibility as more of a mild suggestion than an actual constraint. Alien species began to develop a complex relationship with humanity. They were terrified of us, yes, but they also desperately wanted us on their teams. We were the universal cheat code, the quantum variable that could transform any seemingly unsolvable situation. By the time the Galactic Confederation was formally established, having at least one human on your crew had become not just recommended, but practically mandatory. We were the ultimate diplomatic Swiss Army knife, part negotiator, part chaos agent, part unexpected solution generator. And that's how I ended up here, Captain Arya Novak, about to embark on a mission that would make even the most seasoned space administrators break out in a cold sweat. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you a story about how one human can change everything, whether the universe is ready or not. The Starship Maverick wasn't your typical interstellar vessel. Most ships had sleek uniform designs that screamed professional and predictable. Our ship looked like something that had been cobbled together by a committee of drunk engineers who'd lost a bet. I'm Captain Arya Novak, and I'll be the first to admit that my command style is less by the book, and more, what book? My first officer was Kazara, a Viridian reptilian, whose species typically communicated through complex pheromone exchanges and precise mathematical calculations. Imagine her joy at being paired with a human who solved problems by gut instinct, and occasionally throwing improvised solutions at the wall to see what stuck. Captain, Kazara would often say, her translingual vocoder managing to sound both exasperated and grudgingly impressed, "Your approach defies all logical probability." To which I would invariably respond, "Exactly." Our communications officer, Bryn Holloway, another human, because apparently one of us wasn't chaotic enough, had a talent for languages that bordered on the supernatural. She could not only translate obscure dialects, but could also read the subtle emotional undertones that most universal translators missed. Her current project involved developing a linguistic algorithm that could capture sarcasm across 247 different alien communication systems. The ship's medical officer was Dr. Elaran Roth, a Centaurian, whose multiple brains gave him the unique ability to simultaneously worry about 17 different potential medical scenarios, while maintaining a poker face that would make a Vegas champion weep. His medical kit was a work of art, part scientific marvel, part controlled chaos, much like the rest of our crew. Our navigation and systems expert was Quolek, a silicon-based lifeform from the Andromeda cluster. Quolek processed information at speeds that made quantum computers look like abacuses, but had the personality of a slightly neurotic librarian. They kept meticulous logs of every single one of my unauthorized mission modifications, which I'm pretty sure was their way of both documenting and subtly roasting my command decisions. And then there was me, human, female, perpetually caffeinated, allergic to following standard operating procedures. The Galactic Command had initially been skeptical about assigning me to such a critical diplomatic mission. Their exact words, which I'm quoting verbatim from the mission briefing, were Captain Novak has a remarkable track record of achieving objectives through methods that can only be described as what the actual hell. I took that as a compliment. Our current mission was delicate, the kind of diplomatic nightmare that made seasoned negotiators break out in hives and consider early retirement. The Nexus Confederacy and the harmonic alignment had been on the brink of a full-scale interstellar conflict for decades, with tensions so thick you could cut them with a plasma knife. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed spectacularly. 17 different mediation attempts, countless summit conferences, reams of negotiation transcripts that read like passive-aggressive poetry, and now they wanted us to try. Kazara looked at me with what I can only describe as a mix of professional resignation and morbid curiosity. I assume, she said, her reptilian features somehow managing to convey both skepticism and a hint of anticipation. You have a plan. I grinned. Plan was such a formal word. I preferred strategic improvisation. Little did they know, sometimes the most elegant solutions look like complete chaos right up until the moment they work perfectly. The Nexus Confederacy and the harmonic alignment were about as compatible as a nuclear reactor and a box of matches. Their conflict wasn't just a simple territorial dispute or a misunderstanding. This was a full-blown ideological Cold War that had been simmering for generations. The Nexus Confederacy believed in absolute centralized control. Every aspect of their society was meticulously planned, from birth quotas to career assignments, to daily nutrient intake. Their ships looked like precision-engineered mathematical equations brought to life, all sharp angles, perfect symmetry, and soul-crushing efficiency. The harmonic alignment, on the other hand, was essentially the cosmic equivalent of a free-spirited commune. They believed in complete individual autonomy, to the point where their governance was less a government and more a constantly negotiated social contract. Their ships looked like they'd been designed by artists who'd had one too many psychedelic experiences. These two groups had been dancing around a potential all-out war for so long that galactic bookmakers were taking bets on when the first shots would be fired. The previous diplomatic missions have all failed, Dr. Roth explained, pulling up holographic records that looked like a migraine given visual form. 17 different approaches, 17 complete disasters. Bryn leaned in, her fingers dancing across the holographic displays. Check this out. The last negotiation ended when the Nexus representative literally turned off their universal translator and started doing an interpretive dance of diplomatic frustration. Kazara's mandibles clicked in. What I'd learned was her version of a sardonic laugh. And this is where we come in. Precisely, I said, pulling up the mission parameters. The core issue was surprisingly simple. The harmonic alignment had discovered a series of resource-rich planetary systems in a contested region of space. The Nexus Confederacy claimed these systems were within their historical territorial boundaries. The harmonic alignment argued that historical boundaries were just a suggestion, not a legal mandate. 17 different diplomatic teams had tried to resolve this. 17 teams had failed spectacularly. They don't want to compromise, Kolek calculated, their crystalline data projections shifting like living mathematics. They want total validation of their respective worldviews, which is exactly why they need us, I said. My crew looked at me. That look. The one that said, oh no, she has an idea. The beauty of human diplomacy, and this is something most alien species never quite understood, is our ability to completely reframe a conversation. We don't just negotiate. We transform the entire context of the negotiation. The Nexus Confederacy expected a traditional diplomatic approach, formal presentations, legal arguments, structured debates. The harmonic alignment expected another round of ineffectual discussions that would change nothing. What they were going to get was something entirely different. Bryn, I said, how's your knowledge of obscure Earth cultural references? She raised an eyebrow, comprehensive and slightly concerning. Why? Because, I said, we're about to introduce these fine folks to the concept of cooperative gaming theory. Specifically, a method developed on Earth about 600 years ago. Kolek's processing cores lit up with curiosity. Elaborate. We're going to solve an interstellar conflict, I announced, using the principles of Dungeons and Dragons. The silence that followed was profound. Let me explain something about humans. When we say we're going to solve an interstellar diplomatic crisis using the principles of a 600-year-old tabletop role-playing game, we absolutely mean it. The initial meeting was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. We'd invited representatives from both the Nexus Confederacy and the Harmonic Alignment to what they believed would be a standard diplomatic summit. What they got was a conference room transformed into something between a strategy session and a really intense game night. Kazara had spent 3 sleepless cycles helping me design a custom diplomatic simulation that looked like a cross between a complex board game and a political strategy exercise. Kolek had developed an algorithm that could translate the game's mechanics into real-world diplomatic negotiations. Bryn had sourced historical Earth gaming materials and cultural references that would make absolutely no sense to our alien guests. The Nexus Confederacy sent Administrator Vorlek, a being so precisely calibrated that I'm pretty sure he ironed his own skin every morning. The Harmonic Alignment's representative was Zaira, who looked like she'd just rolled out of a communal meditation retreat and hadn't slept in a week. "Welcome," I said, "to the Galactic Collaborative Negotiation Simulation." Vorlek's translator clicked with mathematical precision. "This is not a standard diplomatic protocol." "Exactly," I responded. The game board was a holographic representation of the contested space sectors. But instead of traditional diplomatic markers, we had game pieces that looked like a bizarre mix of chess figurines and abstract art sculptures. Each piece represented different resources, cultural values, and potential compromise points. The objective, I explained, is not to win. The objective is to create a mutually beneficial outcome that respects both your societal structures. Zaira looked intrigued. Vorlek looked like he was calculating the mathematical probability of my sanity. We started with resource allocation, but this wasn't your standard diplomatic horse trading. Each move required not just strategic thinking, but also a degree of collaborative creativity. Players had to explain the cultural and historical significance of their moves, forcing them to see beyond pure mathematical optimization. In the Harmonic Alignment, Zaira explained while placing a crystalline piece, representing a research outpost. "We believe that potential is more valuable than immediate resource extraction." Vorlek's response was a precisely positioned geometric piece. "The Nexus Confederacy requires structured growth to ensure collective stability." Dr. Roth was monitoring their physiological responses. "Fascinating," he muttered. "They're actually starting to listen to each other." The game continued. Hours passed. Coffee was consumed. At one point Bryn introduced a wild card mechanic that required players to role-play potential conflict scenarios, forcing them to understand each other's perspectives. "Imagine," I said, "that your resource management strategy accidentally displaces a small colony. How would you address the human impact?" The question was a trap, a beautiful, perfectly constructed diplomatic trap. Because humans understand something most species forget. Conflict resolution isn't about winning, it's about understanding. By the time we reached the final round, something remarkable had happened. Vorlek and Zaira were no longer just representatives of their respective societies. They had become collaborators, problem solvers, almost friends. "This is not how diplomatic negotiations are conducted," Vorlek said, his translator somehow managing to sound both bewildered and impressed. "No," I agreed. "This is how they should be conducted." Kazara leaned close to me and whispered, "I hate that this is going to work." I grinned. "That's why they keep humans around." Of course, diplomatic breakthroughs are rarely that simple. And just when we thought we'd solved the problem, the universe decided to throw us a curveball that would make a professional baseball pitcher weep. 3 standard galactic cycles after our unconventional negotiation session, the real test arrived. A rogue mining corporation, the kind that makes space pirates look like responsible corporate citizens, had discovered that the contested space sectors contained a rare quantum resource more valuable than entire planetary economies. Suddenly, our carefully constructed diplomatic detente was about to be shredded faster than a paper document in a hurricane. "They're going to start a war," Kolek calculated, their crystalline data projections spinning with increasing agitation. Probability of conflict 87.6%. The mining corporation, Stellar Dynamics, wasn't interested in diplomacy. They were interested in profit, and they were willing to spark an interstellar conflict to get it. Zara from the Harmonic Alignment was the first to contact us. Her communication was a mixture of panic and desperate hope. They're positioning resource extraction vessels the Nexus Confederacy believes were behind this provocation. Verklick's subsequent transmission confirmed her fears. The Nexus Confederacy was mobilizing its defense fleet, interpreting the mining vessels as a direct challenge to their territorial claims. This was the moment where traditional diplomatic channels would collapse, where centuries of carefully maintained peace would disintegrate into plasma fire and stellar destruction. But we're not traditional, we're human. Bryn, I said, pull everything we know about stellar dynamics. Every contract, every board member, every financial transaction for the last decade, our communications officer was already 3 steps ahead. Her fingers danced across holographic interfaces, breaking through corporate firewalls like they were made of tissue paper. Got something, she said after precisely 17 minutes of investigation. The primary investors of Stellar Dynamics have significant holding in both Nexus Confederacy and Harmonic Alignment pension funds. Dr. Roth's multiple brains started connecting dots faster than a quantum computer. They're trying to create a conflict that would force both societies to invest in military infrastructure, thereby increasing the value of their corporate holdings. Kazera's translator clicked with what could only be described as professional disgust. A war profiteering scheme. Exactly, I said. And we're going to turn their own strategy against them. What followed was a coordinated information campaign that would be studied in diplomatic academies for generations. We didn't just expose Stellar Dynamics, we systematically dismantled their entire economic infrastructure. Bryn broadcasted their financial manipulations on every communication channel. Quolk used complex economic modeling to demonstrate how the proposed conflict would actually devastate the very investors who thought they'd profit. Verklick and Zera, who had weeks ago been ready to go to war now found themselves united against a common threat. The Stellar Dynamics Board of Directors were arrested simultaneously on 17 different planetary systems. Their assets were frozen, their executives were facing charges that would make their great-grandchildren feel legally uncomfortable. This, Kazera said, watching the final reports come in is not standard diplomatic procedure. I grinned. No, this is human problem-solving. The truly terrifying part, we were just getting started. The aftermath was nothing short of spectacular. The Galactic Diplomatic Corps sent 3 separate investigation teams to understand exactly what had happened. Each team left more confused than the last. Their meticulously prepared reports read like fever dreams, half scientific analysis, half existential crisis. Verklick and Zera, who had started as bitter rivals, were now co-authoring a joint economic policy paper. Their working title, which I swear I'm not making up, was Collaborative Governance: Why Rigid Systems and Fluid Dynamics Might Actually Work Together. Roth calculated that we had not only prevented a war but had potentially saved approximately 3.7 trillion sentient lives and prevented economic damage that would have taken 5 generations to recover from. Kazera approached me on the observation deck, her reptilian features somehow managing to look both impressed and slightly terrified. Humans are impossible, she said. It sounded like a compliment. We prefer the term creatively unconventional, I responded. The Starship Maverick had become something of a legend. Not because we were the most technologically advanced vessel, not because we had the most firepower, but because we proved that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is understanding. Bryn was already fielding diplomatic mission requests from 17 different star systems. Quolk was developing predictive models that incorporated what they now called human variability as a legitimate mathematical variable. You realize, Quolk told me during a routine system check, that your approach defies all known diplomatic and strategic models. I grinned. Thank you. The galaxy was learning something fundamental about humanity. We weren't just another species. We were the cosmic wildcards, the unpredictable problem solvers who could transform seemingly impossible situations through sheer audacity and creativity. As we prepared for our next mission, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. Humans had gone from being a relatively young species to becoming the universe's most unexpected diplomats, strategists, and chaotic problem solvers. Captain, the ship's communication system chirped. We've received our next assignment. I looked at my crew, a collection of beings from across the galaxy, united by nothing more than a willingness to embrace the utterly impossible. Well, I said, let's go make some bureaucrats very, very nervous. Just another day in human diplomatic service.